Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Translated from Russian by Antonina W. Bouis. Chapter 4. Frederick Schuhart, age 31. The valley had cooled overnight, and by dawn it was actually cold. They were walking along the embankment, stepping over the rotten ties between the rusty rails, and Frederick watched the drops of condensed fog glisten on Arthur Burbridge's leather jacket. The boy was striding along lightly and merrily, as though the exhausting night, the nervous tension that still made every vein in his body ache, and the 2 horrible hours they spent huddled back to back for warmth in a tortured half-sleep on top of the hill, waiting for the flood of the green stuff to drip past them and disappear into the ravine, as though all that had not happened. A thick fog lay along the sides of the embankment. Once in a while, it crawled up on the rails with its heavy gray feet, and in those places they walked knee-deep in the swirling mists. The air smelled of rust, and the swamp to the right of the embankment reeked of decay. The fog made it impossible to see anything, but Frederick knew that a hilly plain with rubble heaps surrounded them, and that mountains hid in the gloom beyond. And he knew also that when the sun came up and the fog settled into dew, he would see the downed helicopter somewhere on his left and the ore flat cars up ahead. And then the real work would begin. Frederick slipped his hand up under the backpack to lift it so that the edge of the helium tank would not dig into his spine. It's a heavy bugger, he thought. How am I going to crawl with it? A mile on all fours. All right, Stalker, no grumbling now. You knew what you were getting into. 500,000 at the end of the road. I can work up a sweat for that. 500,000 sure is a sweet bundle. I'll be damned if I give it to him for less, or if I give Buzzard more than 30. And the punk? The punk gets nothing. If the old bugger had told even half the truth, the punk gets nothing. He looked at Arthur's back again and watched through squinted eyes as the boy stepped over 2 ties at a time, broad-shouldered, narrow-hipped. His dark raven hair, like his sister's, bounced rhythmically. He asked for it, Frederick thought grimly, himself. Why did he beg to come along so persistently, so desperately? He trembled and had tears in his eyes. Take me, Mr. Schuhart. Lots of people have offered to take me along, but they're all no good. My father. But he can't take me now. Frederick forced himself to drop the memory. He was repelled by the thought, and maybe that's why he started thinking about Arthur's sister. He just could not fathom it. How such a fantastic-looking woman could actually be a plastic fake. A dummy. It was like the buttons on his mother's blouse. They were amber, he remembered, semi-transparent and golden. He just wanted to shove them in his mouth and suck on them, and every time he was disappointed terribly, and every time he forgot about the disappointment. Not forgot, just refused to accept what his memory told him. Maybe it was his pop who sent him over to me, he thought about Arthur. Look at the piece he's carrying in his back pocket. Nah, I doubt it. Buzzard knows me. Buzzard knows that I don't go for jokes, and he knows what I'm like in the zone. No, that's all nonsense. He's not the first to have begged me, and not the first to have shed tears. Others even got down on their knees. And as for the piece, they all bring guns on their first time in the zone. The first and last time. Is it really the last? It's your last, bud. Here's how it works out, Buzzard. His last. Yeah, if you knew what your sonny boy was planning, you would have beaten him to a pulp with your crutches. He suddenly felt that there was something ahead of them, not far, some 30 or 40 yards away. Stop, he told Arthur. The boy obediently froze in his tracks. His reflexes were good. He had stopped with 1 foot in the air, and he lowered it slowly and carefully. Frederick stopped next to him. The track dipped noticeably here and disappeared completely in the fog. And there was something in the fog. Something big and motionless. Harmless. Redrick carefully sniffed the air. Yes. Harmless. Forward, he said quietly. He waited for Arthur to take a step, and he followed. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Arthur's face, his chiseled profile, the clear skin of his cheek, and the determined set of lips under the thin mustache. They were up to their waists in fog, and then up to their necks. A few seconds later, the great hulk of the ore cars loomed ahead of them. That's it, Redrick said and took off his backpack. Sit down right where you are. Smoke break. Arthur helped him with the backpack, and they sat down next to each other on the rusty rails. Redrick unbuttoned a flap and took out a package with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. While Arthur set up the sandwiches on top of the backpack, Redrick took out his flask, opened it, closed his eyes, and took several slow sips. Want some? He offered, wiping the neck of the flask. For courage? Arthur shook his head, hurt. Well, I don't need that for courage, Mr. Shoehart. I'd rather have the coffee, if I may. It's awfully damp here, isn't it? It's damp. He put away the flask, chose a sandwich, and set to chewing. When the fog lifts, you'll see that we're surrounded by nothing but swamps. In the old days, the mosquitoes were something fierce. He shut up and poured himself some coffee. It was hot, thick, and sweet, and it was even nicer to drink now than alcohol. It smelled of home, of Guta, and not just of Guta, but of Guta in her robe, fresh from sleep, with pillow marks still on her cheek. Why did I get mixed up in this, he thought. 500,000, and what do I need it for? Planning to buy a bar with it or something? You need money, so you don't have to think about money. That's the truth. Dick was right about that. You have a house, you have a yard, you won't be without a job in Harmon. Buzzard trapped me, lured me like a tenderfoot. Mr. Shoehart, Arthur suddenly said, looking away, do you really believe this thing grants wishes? Nonsense, Redrick muttered distractedly and froze over the cup near his lips. How do you know what we're after here? Arthur smiled in embarrassment, ran his fingers through his hair, tugged at it, and spoke. Oh, well, I guessed. I don't remember exactly what gave me the clue. Well, first of all, Father was always going on and on about the golden ball, and lately he's stopped. And he's been talking about you, and I know better than to believe Father about you being friends. And secondly, he's been kind of strange lately. Arthur laughed and shook his head, remembering something. And finally, I figured it out when you and he tried out the little dirigible over in the lot. He smacked the backpack that contained the tightly rolled balloon. Followed you, and when I saw you lift the bag with rocks and guide it over the ground, it was all clear to me. As far as I know, the golden ball's the only heavy thing left in the zone. He took a bite out of his sandwich and smoked dreamily with his mouth full. I just don't understand how you plan to hook onto it. It's probably smooth. Redrick watched him over the rim of the cup and thought how unlike each other they were, father and son. They had absolutely nothing in common. Not face, or voice, or soul. Buzzard had a hoarse, whiny, sneaky kind of voice. But when he talked about this, his voice was hearty. He couldn't ignore him. Red, he had said then, leaning over the table. There are only two of us left and only two legs for both, and they're yours. Who else but you? It's probably the most valuable thing in the zone. And who should have it? Should those wise guys with their machinery get it? Ha! I found it. Me. How many of our boys fell there? But I found it. I was saving it for myself. And I wouldn't be giving it to anyone now. But as you see, my arms have gotten too short. There's nobody left but you. I dragged lots of young ones in there. A school full. Helping a school form, you see. They can't. They don't have the guts for it or something. All right, you don't believe me. I don't care. You want the money? You'll get it. You give me as much as you want. I know you won't jip me. And maybe I'll be able to get my legs back. Legs, do you understand? The zone took them away. And maybe it'll give them back. What? Redrick asked, coming out of his reverie. I asked, do you mind if I smoke, Mr. Shoehart? Sure. Go ahead and smoke. I'll have one too. He gulped the rest of the coffee, pulled out a cigarette, and as he squeezed it, he gazed into the thinning fog. A psycho, he thought. He's nuts. He wants his legs back, the bastard. All this talk had left a residue. He was not sure of what, and it was not dissolving with time, but on the contrary, it was accumulating. And he could not understand what it was, but it was bothering him. It was as though he had caught something from Buzzard, not some disgusting disease, but on the contrary. His strength, perhaps? No, not strength. But what then? All right, he told himself. Let's look at it this way. Let's assume that I didn't get this far. I was all ready to go, packed, and then something happened. They arrested me. Say, would that be bad? Definitely. Why bad? Because I would lose money? No, it has nothing to do with the money. That this treasure would fall into the hands of Throaty and Bones? There's something in that. It would hurt, but what do I care? In the end, they'll get it all anyway. Arthur shivered. It's into your bones, Mr. Schuhart. Maybe now you'll give me a sip. Roger got the flask silently. I didn't agree right away, he thought. 20 times I told Buzzard to get lost, and on the 21st I agreed. After all, I couldn't take it anymore. Our last conversation turned out to be brief and businesslike. I brought the map, maybe you'll take a look at it after all. Then I looked into his eyes, and they were like sores, yellow with black dots, and I said, let me have it. And that was it. I remember that I was drunk then. I'd been drinking all week. I felt really low. The hell with it. Does it matter? I went, so here I am. Why am I worrying about it? What, am I afraid? He shuddered. He could hear a long, sad sound through the fog. He jumped up, and Arthur jumped up too. But it was quiet again, and the only sound was the gravel tumbling down the incline under their feet. Must be the ore settling, Arthur whispered unsurely, barely able to get the words out. The ore cars have a history. They've been here a long time. Redrick looked ahead and saw nothing. He remembered. It was at night. He woke up from the same sound, sad and long, his heart stopping like in a dream, only it hadn't been a dream. It was Monkey, screaming in her bed by the window. Guto woke up too and took Redrick's hand. He could feel the sweat break out on her shoulder against his. They lay there and listened, and when Monkey stopped crying and went back to sleep, he waited a little longer, then got up, went down to the kitchen, and greedily drank a half bottle of cognac. That was the night he started drinking. It's the ore, Arthur said. You know, it's settled with time. The dampness, erosion, all kinds of things like that. Redrick looked at his pale face and sat down again. His cigarette had disappeared somewhere from his fingers, and he lit another one. Arthur stood a little longer, looking around anxiously, then he also sat down. I've heard that there's life in the zone. People. Not visitors, but people. It seems the visitation caught them here, and they mutated. They've acclimated to the new conditions. Have you heard that too, Mr. Schuhart? Yes, Redrick said, but not here. In the mountains, in the northwest, some shepherds. That's what he infected me with, he thought. His madness. That's why I've come here. That's what I want here. A strange and very new feeling overwhelmed him. He was aware that the feeling was really not new at all, that it had been hidden in him for a long time, but that he was only acknowledging it now. And everything was falling into place. And everything that had seemed like nonsense and the delirious ravings of a crazy old man turned out to be his only hope, the only meaning of his life, because he finally understood. The only thing he had left in the world, the only thing he lived for in the last few months was the hope of a miracle. Fool that he was, he kept pushing hope away, trampling on it, mocking it, trying to drink it away, because that was the way he was used to living. Since childhood, he had relied on nothing but himself. and since childhood, his self-reliance had been measured in the amount of money he could snatch, grab, or bite away from the indifferent chaos that surrounded him. It had always been that way, and it would have continued if he had not ended up in a hole that no amount of money could get him out of, and in which it was absolutely useless to rely on himself. And now this hope, no longer a hope, but confidence in a miracle, filled him to the brim. And he was amazed at how he could have lived for so long in the impenetrable, exitless gloom. He laughed and gave Arthur a poke in the shoulder. Well, Stalker, think we'll live through this? Huh? Arthur looked at him in surprise and smiled uncertainly. Redrick crumpled up the wax paper from the sandwiches, tossed it under the ore car, and lay down, his elbow in the backpack. All right, he said. Let's say that the golden ball really exists. What would you wish? Oh, you mean you do believe? Arthur asked quickly. That's not important whether I believe or not. Answer my question. He really was interested in what such a young boy, a schoolboy just yesterday, could ask of the golden ball. He enjoyed watching Arthur frown, tug at his mustache, and look at him up and down and then look away. Oh, well, Dad's legs, of course. And for everything to be all right at home. You're lying, Redrick said pleasantly. Keep this in mind, brother. The golden ball only grants your deepest, innermost wishes, the kind that if they're not granted, it's all over for you. Arthur Burbridge blushed, looked up at Redrick once more, and became even redder. His eyes filled with tears. Redrick grinned. I understand, he said, almost gently. All right, it's none of my business. Keep your secrets to yourself. He suddenly remembered the gun and thought that, while he had the time, he should take care of whatever could be taken care of. What's that in your back pocket? He asked casually. Oh, a gun? What do you need it for? To shoot, Arthur said challengingly. Forget it, Redrick said firmly and sat up. Give it here. There's nobody to shoot at in the zone. Give it to me. Arthur wanted to say something but kept silent, took the army Colt from his pocket, and handed it to Red by the barrel. Redrick took the gun by its warm, textured handle, tossed it up in the air, and caught it. Do you have a handkerchief or something? I want to wrap it up. He took Arthur's handkerchief, clean and smelling of cologne, wrapped the gun in it, and put it on the railroad tie. We'll leave it here for now. God willing, we'll come back and pick it up. Maybe we'll have to shoot it out with the patrol guards. However, shooting out with them... Arthur decisively shook his head. That's not what I wanted it for, he said sadly. There's only one bullet, in case of an accident like Father's. So, that's it. Redrick stared at him. Well, you don't have to worry about that. If that should happen, I'll drag you back here. I promise. Look, it's getting light. The fog was disappearing before their eyes. It was completely gone from the embankment, and in the distance it was thinning, melting away, and showing the rounded, bristly peaks of the hills. Here and there, between the hills, could be seen the mottled surface of the stagnant swamps, covered with sparse thickets of willows, and the horizon, beyond the hills, was filled with the bright yellow explosions of mountain peaks, and the sky above them was clear and blue. Arthur looked back and gasped with awe. Redrick looked too. In the east, the mountains looked black, and over them the familiar green wash of color billowed and shone iridescently. The zone's green dawn. Redrick got up, went behind the ore car, sat on the embankment and watched as the green wash dimmed and quickly turned to pink. The sun's orange rim came up over the ridge, and purple shadows stretched from the hills. Everything became harsh and in high relief. He could see things as clearly as if they were in the palm of his hand. Right in front, 200 yards away, Redrick saw the helicopter. It had fallen, apparently, into the middle of a mosquito mange spot, and its fuselage had been squashed into a metal pancake. Its tail had remained intact, only slightly bent, and it stuck out over the glade like a black hook. The stabilizer was also whole, and it squeaked distinctly, turning in the light breeze. The mange must have been very powerful, for there hadn't even been a real fire, and the Royal Air Force insignia was very clear on the flattened metal. Frederick had not seen one in many years, and had almost forgotten what the insignia looked like. Frederick went back to his pack for the map, which he spread out on the hot mound of ore in the car. You couldn't see the quarry from here. It was blocked by the hill with the burned-out tree on its rise. He had to go around the hill from the right, along the depression between it and the next hill, which he could also see, completely bare, its slope covered with brown rocks. All the reference points corresponded, but Frederick felt no satisfaction. His instinct of many years as a stalker protested against the very thought, which was irrational and unnatural, of laying a path between two nearby elevations. All right, Frederick thought. We'll see about that later. It'll be clearer when we get there. The path before the depression led through the swamp, along open flat ground, which seemed safe enough from here. But looking closer, Frederick noted a dark gray spot between the two dry hills. He looked at the map. There was an X there, and it said whip next to it in clumsy letters. The red dotted line of the path went to the right of the X. The name was sort of familiar, but who Whip was exactly, and what he looked like, and what he did, Frederick could not remember. For some reason, Frederick could only remember the smoky room of the Borscht, huge red paws holding glasses, thundering laughter, and open jaws filled with yellow teeth. A fantastic herd of titans and giants gathered at the watering hole, one of his most striking childhood memories. His first visit to the Borscht. What had I brought that time? An empty, I think, straight from the zone, wet, hungry, crazy, with a sack over my shoulder. I burst into the bar and clattered the sack on the counter in front of Ernest, looking around angrily, listening to the wisecracks, waiting for Ernest, who was young then and in a bow tie as usual, to count the right amount of greenbacks. Wait, no, it wasn't green back then. We still had the square royal bills with some half-naked dame wearing a cape and a wreath. I waited, put away the money, and, unexpectedly even for myself, took a heavy mug from the counter and slammed it into the closest laughing face. Frederick smirked and thought, maybe that was Whip himself. Is it all right to go between the two hills, Mr. Schuhart? Arthur asked in a low voice near his ear. He was next to him looking at the map too. We'll see when we get there. Frederick kept looking at the map. There were two other X's, one on the slope of the hill with the tree, the other on the rocks. Poodle and Four Eyes. The path was marked below them. We'll see, he repeated, folding up the map and putting it in his pocket. He looked Arthur over. Put the backpack on my back. We'll go like before, he said, shifting under the weight of the pack and arranging the straps more comfortably. You go ahead so that I can see you every second. Don't look back, and keep your ears open. My order is law. Keep in mind that we'll have a lot of crawling to do, so don't suddenly be afraid of the dirt. If I tell you, drop your face into the mud without any back talk. And button your jacket. Ready? Ooh, ready. Arthur was very nervous. The rosiness of his cheeks had disappeared. First, we go this way. Frederick waved sharply in the direction of the nearest hill 100 steps from the rocks. Got it? Let's go. Arthur heaved a sigh, stepped over the rails, and started down sideways from the embankment. The pebbles rained after him noisily. Easy, easy, Frederick said. There's no hurry. He started down slowly after him, automatically adjusting his leg muscles to the weight of the heavy backpack. He watched Arthur out of the corner of his eye. He's scared, he thought. He must sense it. If his sense is like his father's, he does. If only you knew how things were turning out, Buzzard. If only you knew, Buzzard, that I took your advice this time. This is one place, Red, that you can't go to alone. Like it or not, you'll have to take somebody with you. I can give you one of my people who's expendable. You talked me into it. It's the first time in my life that I agreed to something like this. Well, maybe it'll turn out all right, he thought. Maybe somehow it will work out. After all, I'm not Buzzard Burbridge. Maybe I'll figure something out. Stop, he told Arthur. The boy stopped ankle-deep in rusty water. By the time Redrick got down to him, the quagmire had sucked him up into his knees. "Do you see that rock?" Redrick asked. "There, under the hill. Head for it." Arthur moved on. Redrick let him get 10 paces ahead and then followed. The mud slurped underfoot. It was a dead swamp. No bugs, no frogs, even the willows were dry and rotten. Redrick looked around, but for now everything seemed to be in order. The hill slowly got closer, covering the sun, which was still low in the sky, and finally blocking the entire eastern sky. At the rock, Redrick looked back at the embankment. It was brightly lit by the sun. A train of 10 ore cars stood on it. Some of the cars had fallen off the tracks and were lying on their sides, and the embankment above them was covered with the rusty red piles of the ore. Further on, in the direction of the quarry, north of the train, the air over the track shimmered and undulated, and tiny rainbows exploded and died in the air. Redrick looked at the shimmer, spat, and turned away. "Let's go," he said. Arthur turned his tense face to him. "See those rags over there? No, you're looking the wrong way. Over there. To the right." Yes," said Arthur. "Well, that was a guy called Whip. A long time ago, he didn't listen to his elders, and now he lies there in order to show smart people the right way. Look just to the right of Whip. Got it? See the spot? Right where the willows are a little thicker? That's the way. You're off." Now they were moving parallel to the embankment. Every step brought them to shallower water, and soon they were walking on dry, springy hillocks. The map still showed this as a solid swamp. "The map's old," thought Redrick. "Burbridge hasn't been here in a long time, and it's gotten out of date. That's bad. Of course, it's easier to walk on dry land, but it would have been better for that swamp to be here." "Look at Arthur go," he thought. "He's walking like he's strolling down Central Avenue." Arthur seemed to have perked up and was walking full speed. He had one hand in his pocket and was swinging the other as if out on a stroll. Redrick rummaged in his pocket, took out a bolt weighing an ounce or so, and threw it at his head. The bolt hit Arthur in the back of the head. The boy gasped, grabbed his head, crouched, and fell into the dry grass. Redrick stood over him. "That's how it comes out here, Artie," he pontificated. "This isn't an avenue. We're not on a promenade here, you know." Arthur got up slowly. His face was drained white. "Everything clear?" Redrick asked. Arthur gulped and nodded. "Fine. And next time I'll let you have it in the teeth. If you're still alive. Go ahead." The boy could have made a stalker after all, thought Redrick. And they probably would have called him Pretty Boy Artie. "We used to have another pretty boy. His name was Dixon, but now they called him Hamster. The only stalker to fall into the meat grinder and live. He was lucky. The fool still thinks that it was Burbridge who pulled him out of it. The hell he did. You don't get pulled out of the meat grinder. He did pull him out of the zone. That's true enough. Burbridge performed a heroic deed like that. If he hadn't, everybody was getting fed up with his tricks, and the guys had told him, you better not come back if you come back alone. That was when they began calling him Buzzard. Before, they used to call him Winner. Redrick felt a barely perceptible current of air on his left cheek, and immediately, without thinking, he shouted, "Halt!" He extended his hand to the left. The current was stronger. Somewhere between them and the embankment, there was a mosquito mange. Or maybe it extended along the embankment itself. There was a reason why the cars had tilted over. Arthur stood as though he had been planted. He didn't even turn around. "To the right. Let's go." Yes, he would have made a good stalker. What the hell, do I feel sorry for him or something? That's all I need. Did anyone ever feel sorry for me? Well, I guess they did. Kirill felt sorry for me. Dick Noonan feels sorry for me. Of course, he might be more interested in Guta than in feeling sorry for me, but one doesn't necessarily rule out the other. Only I don't get to feel pity. My choice is always either or. He finally understood the choice. Either this boy or my monkey. There was no real choice. It was clear. If only miracles did happen, some voice said inside, and he repressed the voice with horror. They went around the mound of gray rags. There was nothing left of Whip. Some distance away in the dry grass lay a long, completely rusted stick. A minesweeper. In those days, many stalkers used minesweepers, buying them up on the quiet from army suppliers and depended on them like the Lord God himself. And then 2 stalkers were killed within a few days by underground explosions. And that put an end to it. Who had this Whip been? Did Buzzard bring him here, or had he come on his own? Why were they all drawn to this quarry? Why hadn't I heard anything about it? Damn, it's hot. And this is so early in the morning, I can imagine what it'll be like later. Arthur, walking 5 paces ahead, wiped the sweat from his brow. Redrick squinted up at the sun. It was still low. And suddenly he realized that the dry grass was not rustling underfoot, but squeaking like cornstarch. And it was no longer stiff and bristly, but soft and crumbly. It was falling apart under their shoes like flakes of soot. And he saw Arthur's clear footprints, and he threw himself down on the ground, shouting, "Hit the dirt!" He fell face down into the grass, and it turned into dust under his cheek. He gnashed his teeth in anger over their bad luck. He lay there, trying not to move, still hoping that it would blow over, even though he realized that they were trapped. The heat was increasing, overwhelming him, enveloping his body like a sheet soaked in boiling water. Sweat poured into his eyes, and Redrick shouted belatedly to Arthur, "Don't move! Bear it!" And he started bearing it himself. He would have withstood it, and everything would have passed quietly and well. They would have gotten by with a lot of sweat, but Arthur couldn't take it. Either he had not heard Redrick shout, or he became scared out of his wits, or maybe he had been baked more strongly than Redrick. Anyway, he lost control and ran off blindly, with a scream deep in his throat following his instinct. Backward. The very direction they couldn't take. Redrick barely managed to rise and grab his ankle with both hands. Arthur fell down with the full weight of his body, raising a cloud of ashes, squealed in an unnatural voice, kicked Red in the face with his other foot, and struggled wildly. Redrick, not thinking clearly anymore through the pain, crawled on top of him, touching his leather jacket with his burned face, trying to press the boy into the ground, holding his long hair with both hands, and desperately kicking his feet and knees at Arthur's legs and his rear end at the dirt. He could barely hear the muffled moans coming from beneath him and his own hoarse shouts. "Lie there, you toad! Lie still or I'll kill you!" Tons and tons of hot coals were pouring over him, and his clothing was in flames, and the leather of his shoes and jacket was blistering and cracking, and Redrick, his head mashed into the gray ash, his chest trying to keep the damn boy's head down, could not stand it. He yelled his lungs out. He did not remember when it all ended. He understood only that he could breathe again, and the air was air again and not steam that burned his throat, and he realized that they had to hurry and get out from under the devilish heat before it came crashing down on them again. He got off Arthur, who was lying perfectly still, tucked both his legs under one arm, and using his free arm, crawled forward, never taking his eyes off the line where the grass started again. It was dead, prickly, and dry, but it was real, and it seemed like the greatest source of life in the world. The ashes felt gritty in his teeth, his burnt face gave off heat, and the sweat poured right into his eyes, probably because he no longer had eyebrows or eyelashes. Arthur was stretched out behind, his jacket seeming to catch on to every possible place. Redrick's parboiled hands ached, and the backpack kept bumping into his burned neck. The pain and lack of air made Redrick think that he was completely burned and that he would not make it. The fear made him work harder with his elbows and knees. Just get there. Just a little more. Come on, Red. Come on, you can make it. Just like that. A little more. Then he lay for a long time, his face and hands in the cold, rusty water, luxuriating in the smelly, rotten coolness. He could have lain like that forever, but he forced himself to get up on his knees, throw off the backpack, crawl over to Arthur, who was still lying motionless some 30 feet from the swamp, and turn him over on his back. Well, he used to be a pretty boy, and now that handsome face was a dark gray mask of baked-on blood and ash. For a few seconds, Redrick examined with dull interest the ruts and furrows made in the mask, the tracks of stones and sticks. Then he got up on his feet, picked up Arthur by the armpits, and dragged him into the water. Arthur was breathing hoarsely, moaning once in a while. Redrick threw him face down into the deepest puddle and fell down next to him, reliving the pleasure of the wet, icy caress. Arthur gurgled, moved about, braced himself on his hands, and raised his head. He was bug-eyed. He understood nothing and was greedily gulping air, coughing, and spitting. Then he came to his senses. His gaze settled on Redrick. He shook his head, scattering dirty drops of water. "What was that, Mr. Shoehart?" "That was death," Redrick murmured and coughed. He felt his face. It hurt. His nose was swollen, but his brows and lashes, strangely enough, were in place, and the skin on his hands remained intact, but red. Arthur was also gingerly touching his face. Now that the horrible mask had been washed away, his face, also contrary to expectation, turned out to be all right. There were a few scratches, a bump on his forehead, and his lower lip was split, but all in all, okay. "I've never heard of anything like that," Arthur said, looking back. Redrick looked back too. There were many tracks on the gray, ashy grass, and Redrick was amazed to see how short his terrible, endless path had been when he crawled to save them from doom. It was only 20 or 30 yards from one edge of the burnt-out grass to the other, but in his blindness and fear he had crawled in some wild zigzag like a roach on a hot skillet, and thank God he had at least crawled in the right direction. He could have gotten into the mosquito mange on the left, or he could have gotten turned around completely. No, that would not have happened to him. He was no greenhorn. And if it had not been for that fool, then nothing at all would have happened. He would have gotten blisters on his feet. That would have been it as far as injuries. He looked at Arthur. Arthur was washing up, moaning as he touched the sore spots. Redrick stood up and, wincing from the pain of his clothes on his burnt skin, walked to a dry spot and examined the backpack. The pack had really taken a beating. The top buckles had melted, and the vials in the first aid kit had burst to hell, and a damp spot reeked of antiseptic. Redrick opened the pack and started picking out the slivers of glass and plastic when he heard Arthur's voice. "Thank you, Mr. Shoehart. You saved my life." Redrick said nothing. "Thanks. You fell apart and I had to rescue you." "It was my own fault. I heard you order to lie there, but I was really scared when it got so hot. I lost my head. I'm very much afraid of pain, Mr. Shoehart." "Why don't you get up?" Redrick said without turning around toward him. "That was just a sample. Get up, what are you loafing around for?" Wincing from the pain of the pack on his burned shoulders, he put his arms through the straps. It felt as though the skin on the burned places had wrinkled up. He was afraid of pain, was he? "I'll shove you in your pain." He looked around. It was all right. They hadn't left the path. Now for the hills with the corpses. The damn hills just stood there, the lousy mothers sticking out like the devil's horns, and that damn depression between them. He sniffed the air. You damn depression, that's the really lousy part, the toad. See that depression between the hills? "I see it." "Head straight forward. March." Arthur wiped his face with the back of his hand and moved on, splashing through the puddles. He was limping and did not look as straight and well-proportioned as he had before. He was bent over and was walking very carefully. "That's another one I pulled out," thought Redrick. "What does that make? 5? 6? And now I wonder why? He's no relation. I'm not responsible for him. Listen, Red, why did you save him? You almost got it yourself because of him." Now that my mind is clear, I know why. It was right to save him. I can't manage without him. He's my hostage from Monkey. I didn't save a human being, I saved my minesweeper, my master key. Back there in the heat, I never gave it a second thought. I pulled him out like he was my flesh and blood, and didn't even think about abandoning him even though I had forgotten everything. The master key and Monkey. What does that mean? It means that I really am a good guy after all. That's what Goethe insists, and Kirill used to say, and what Richard is always babbling about. Some good guy they found. Drop it, he told himself. You have to think first and then use your arms and legs. Got that straight? Mr. Nice Guy. I have to save him for the meat grinder, he thought coldly and clearly. We can get past everything, except the grinder. Stop. The depression lay before them, and Arthur was already standing there, looking at Redrick for orders. The floor of the depression was covered with a rotten green slime that glinted oilily in the sun. A light steam rose above it, getting thicker between the hills, and nothing was visible beyond 30 feet. And it stank. It'll really stink in there, but don't you chicken out. Arthur made a noise in the back of his throat and backed away. Redrick shook himself back into action, pulled from his pocket a wad of cotton soaked in deodorant, stuffed up his nostrils, and offered some to Arthur. Thanks, Mr. Shoehart. Is there a land route we could take? Arthur asked in a weak voice. Redrick silently took him by the hair and turned his head in the direction of the bundle of rags on the stony hillside. That was Four Eyes, he said, and on the left hill you can't see from here lies Poodle, in the same condition. Do you understand? Forward. The slime was warm and sticky. At first they walked direct, waist-deep in the slime. Luckily, the bottom was rocky and rather even. But soon Redrick heard the familiar rumble from both sides. There was nothing on the left hill except the intense sunlight, but on the right slope in the shade, pale purple lights were fluttering. Bend low, he whispered and bent over himself. Lower, stupid! Arthur bent over in fright, and a clap of thunder shattered the air. Right over their heads, an intricate lightning bolt danced furiously, barely visible against the bright sky. Arthur sat down, shoulder deep in the slime. Redrick, ears clogged by the noise, turned and saw a bright red spot quickly melting in the shade among the pebbles and rocks, and there was another thunderclap. Forward! Forward! He shouted, unable to hear himself. Now they were moving in a crouch, Indian file, only their heads exposed. At every peel, Redrick watched Arthur's long hair stand on end and could feel 1,000 needles puncturing his face. Forward! He kept repeating. Forward! He could not hear a thing anymore. Once he saw Arthur's profile and then saw his terror-stricken eyes bulging out in his white, bouncing lips and his green, smeared, sweaty cheek. Then the lightning began striking so low that they had to duck their heads. The green slime gummed his mouth, making it hard to breathe. Gulping for air, Redrick tore the cotton out of his nose and discovered that the reek was gone, that the air was filled with the fresh, piercing odor of ozone, and that the steam was getting thicker. Or maybe he was blacking out, and he could no longer see either of the two hills. All he could see was Arthur's head, sticky with green slime, and the billowing clouds of yellow steam. I'll get through this. I'll get through, Redrick thought. This is nothing new. My whole life is like this. I'm stuck in filth and there's lightning over my head. It's never been any other way. Where is all this gunk coming from? You could go crazy with this much gunk in one place. Buzzard Burbridge did this. He walked through and left this behind. Four Eyes lay on the right, Poodle on the left, and all so that Buzzard could walk between them and leave all his filth behind. That's what you deserve, he told himself. Whoever walks behind Buzzard walks up to his neck in filth. You didn't know that? There are too many buzzards. That's why there isn't a single clean place left. Noonan's a fool. Redrick, Red, you violate the balance. You destroy the order. You're unhappy, Red, under any order, any system. You're not happy under a bad one. You're not happy under a good one. It's people like you who keep us from having the kingdom of heaven on earth. What do you know, fatso? Where have you seen a good system? Where have you ever seen me under a good system? He slipped on a stone that turned under his foot and fell in. He surfaced and saw Arthur's terrified face right next to his. For a second he felt a chill. He thought that they had lost his way. But he had not gotten lost. He realized immediately that they had to go that way. Where the black top of the rock stuck out of the slime, he realized that even though there was nothing else visible in the yellow fog. "Stop!" he shouted. "Keep right! To the right of the rock!" He could not hear his own voice. He caught up with Arthur, grabbed his shoulder, and pointed. "Keep right of the rock and keep your head down." "You'll pay for this," he thought. Arthur dove under at the rock just as a lightning bolt hit it, smashing it to smithereens. "You'll pay for this," he repeated as he ducked under and worked furiously with his arms and legs. He could hear another peal of thunder. "I'll shake your souls out of you for this." He had a fleeting thought. Who do I mean? I don't know, but somebody has to pay for this and somebody will. Just wait. Just let me get to the ball, and when I get to the ball, I'm no buzzard. I'll get what I want from you. When they finally scrambled out onto dry land that was covered by sun-heated pebbles, they were half dead, turned inside out, and staggering and holding on to each other. Redrick saw the peeling pickup truck sagging on its axles, and he remembered that they could rest in the shade of the truck. They crawled into the shade. Arthur lay on his back and began unbuttoning his jacket with limp fingers, and Redrick leaned his backpack against the side of the truck, wiped his hands against the small rocks, and reached inside his jacket. And me too, Arthur said. Me too. Redrick was surprised by the loudness of the boy's voice. He took a sip, shut his eyes, and handed the flask to Arthur. "That's it," he thought weakly. "We got through this. We got through even this. And now, accounts payable upon demand. Do you think that I forgot? No way. I remember it all. Do you think I'll thank you for letting me live and not drowning me? You'll get zilch from me. This is the end for all of you. Get it? I'm not leaving any of this. From now on, I make all the decisions. I, Redrick Shoehart, being of sound mind and body, will make all the decisions for everybody. And as for all of you, buzzards, toads, visitors, boneses, quarterblads, bloodsuckers, greenbackers, throaties, in your suits and ties, clean and fresh, with your briefcases and speeches and good deeds and employment opportunities, and your eternal batteries and eternal engines and mosquito manges and false promises, I've had enough. You've led me by the nose long enough. All my life you've led me by the nose, and I thought and bragged that I was living the way I wanted to. Fool! And all the time you were egging me on and winking among yourselves and leading me by the nose, dragging me, hauling me through jails and bars. I've had it. He unsnapped the straps of the pack and took the flask from Arthur. I never thought, Arthur was saying with meek disbelief in his voice. I couldn't even imagine. I know about death and fire and all, of course, but something like that? How are we going to get back? Redrick was not listening. What that thing was saying no longer had any meaning. It had no meaning before either, but before it was a person at least. And now, it was like a talking key. A key to open the way to the golden ball. Let it talk. If we get some water, Arthur said, at least wash our faces. Redrick looked at him distractedly, saw the disheveled and glued-together hair, the face smeared with drying slime with finger marks in it, and all of him covered with a crust of oozing slime, and he felt no pity, no irritation, nothing. A talking key. He turned away. A dreary expanse, like an abandoned construction site, yawned before them. It was covered with broken brick, sprinkled with white dust and highlighted by the blinding sun, which was unbearably white, hot, angry, and dead. The far end of the quarry was visible from there, also blindingly white and, at that distance, seeming perfectly smooth and perpendicular. The near end was marked by large breaks and boulders, and there was the path down into the quarry, where the excavator's cabin stood out like a red splotch against the white rock. That was the only landmark. They had to head for it, depending on dumb luck to guide them. Arthur propped himself up, stuck his arm under the truck, and pulled out a rusty tin can. Huh, look at that, Mr. Shoehart, he said, livening up. Father must have left this. There's more under there. Redrick didn't reply. That's a mistake, he thought dispassionately. Better not think about your father now. You'd be better off not saying anything. On the other hand, it doesn't matter. Getting up, he winced. His clothes had stuck to his body, to his burned skin, and now something was tearing inside, like a dried bandage pulling from a wound. Arthur also groaned as he got up. He gave Redrick a martyred look. It was clear that he wanted to complain, but that he didn't dare. He only said in a strangled voice, Do you think I might have another sip, Mr. Shoehart? Redrick put the flask that he had been holding back under his shirt. Do you see that red between the rocks? I see it, Arthur said and shuddered. Straight for it. Let's go. Arthur stretched his arms, straightened his shoulders, grimaced, and said, looking around, I wish I could wash up. Everything's sticking. Redrick waited silently. Arthur looked at him hopelessly, nodded, and was about to start when he stopped suddenly. Oh, the backpack. Ye forgot the backpack, Mr. Shoehart. March, Redrick ordered. He didn't want to explain or to lie, and there was no need. He would go anyway. He had nowhere else to go. He'd go. And Arthur went. He wandered on, hunched over, dragging his feet, trying to pick off the baked slime from his face, looking small, scrawny, and forlorn, like a wet, stray kitten. Redrick walked behind him, and as soon as he stepped out of the shade, the sun seared and blinded him, and he shaded his eyes with his hands and was sorry that he had not taken his sunglasses. Every step raised a cloud of white dust, and the dust settled on his shoes and gave off an unbearable stench. Or rather, it came from Arthur. It was impossible to walk behind him. It took him a while to understand that the stench was coming from himself. The odor was disgusting, but somehow familiar. That was the smell that filled the city on the days that the north wind carried the smoke from the plant. And his father smelled that way too, when he came home, hungry, gloomy, with red, wild eyes. And Redrick would hurry to hide in some faraway corner and watch in fear as his father tore off his work clothes and tossed them to his mother, pulled off his huge, worn shoes and shoved them on the floor of the closet, and stalked off to the shower in his stocking feet, leaving sticky footprints. He would stay in the shower, grunting and slapping his body for a long time, splashing water and muttering under his breath until he shouted so that the house shook, Maria, are you asleep? He had to wait until his father had washed and seated himself at the table where a pint bottle, a bowl with thick soup, and a bottle of ketchup were ready for him. Wait until he had slurped up all the soup and started on the pork and beans, and then he could creep out into the light, climb up on his lap, and ask which shop steward and which engineer he had drowned in vitriol that day. Everything around him was white-hot, and he was dizzy from the cruel dry heat, the exhaustion, and the unbearable pain of his skin blistering at the joints. It seemed to him, through the hot haze that was enveloping his consciousness, that his skin was crying out to him, begging him for peace, for water, for coolness. The memories, worn to the point of unrecognizability, were crowding each other in his swollen brain, knocking each other over, blending, tumbling, mingling with the white-hot world that was flaming before his half-closed eyes. And they were all bitter, and they all evoked self-pity or hatred. He tried to fight the chaos, to summon from the past some sweet mirage, a feeling of tenderness or cheerfulness. He squeezed out the fresh, laughing face of Guta from the depths of his memory when she was still a girl, desired and untouched, and her face appeared but was immediately blanketed by rust, and then twisted and deformed into the sullen face of Monkey, covered with coarse brown fur. He struggled to remember Kirill, that sainted man, his swift, sure movements, his laugh, his voice which promised unheard-of, marvelous places and times. And Kirill appeared. But then a silver cobweb exploded on the sun, and Kirill was no more, and Throaty's unblinking, angelic eyes stared at Redrick, a porcelain container in his big, white hand. The dark thoughts festering in his subconscious knocked down the barrier his will tried to create and extinguished the little good that his memory contained, and it seemed that there had never been anything good at all. only vicious, ugly faces. And during all this time, he never stopped being a stalker. Without realizing it, he recorded somewhere in his system the essential information. That on the left, at a safe distance, there was a jolly ghost over a pile of old planks. It was quiet, exhausted, and so the hell with it. On the right there was a slight breeze, and a few steps later he saw a mere smooth mosquito mange, with many arms like a starfish. Far away, no danger. And right in its center, a flattened bird. A rare sight since birds did not often fly over the zone, and right by the path there were 2 abandoned empties. Apparently, Buzzard had dropped them on the way back. Fear is stronger than greed. He saw all of this and took it into account, and Arthur had only to stray a single foot from their path for Redrick's mouth to open and the hoarse warning to fly automatically from his throat. A machine, he thought. You made a machine out of me. The broken rocks at the edge of the quarry were getting closer, and he could see the fanciful designs made by rust on the cabin's red roof. You fool, you, Burbridge, Redrick thought. You're clever, but you're a fool. How could you have trusted me? You've known me for so long, you should know me better than I know myself. You're getting old, that must be it. Getting dumber. But what am I saying? I've been dealing with fools all my life. And then he pictured Buzzard's face when he discovered that Arthur, his sweet Artie, his one and only son, that his pride and joy had gone into the zone with Red after Buzzard's legs, not some expendable punk. He pictured his face and laughed. When Arthur turned his frightened face to look at him, Redrick went on laughing and motioned him on. And then the faces across his consciousness again, like pictures on a screen. Everything had to be changed. Not one life or 2 lives, not one fate or 2. Every link in this rotten, stinking world had to be changed. Arthur stopped at a steep descent into the quarry, froze in his steps, straining to look down and into the distance, extending his long neck. Redrick joined him, but he did not look where Arthur was looking. Right at their feet the road into the quarry began, torn up many years ago by the heat, treads, and wheels of heavy vehicles. To the right was a white, steep slope, cracked by the heat. The next slope was half excavated, and among the rocks and rubble stood a bulldozer, its lowered bucket jammed impotently against the side of the road. And, as was to be expected, there was nothing else to be seen on the road except for the black, twisted stalactites that looked like fat candles hanging from the jagged edges of the slope, and a multitude of black splotches in the dust as though someone had spilled bitumen. That was all that was left of them. It was even impossible to tell how many there had been. Maybe each splotch represented a person, or one of Buzzard's wishes. That one there was Buzzard coming back alive and unharmed from the basement of Complex 7. That bigger one over there was Buzzard getting the wriggling magnet out of the zone unscathed. And that icicle was the luxurious Dina Burbridge, who resembled neither her mother nor her father, and that spot there was Arthur Burbridge, unlike his father and mother. Artie, the handsome son, their pride and joy. "We made it," Arthur rasped deliriously. "Mr. Schuhart, we did make it. After all, right?" He laughed a happy laugh, crouched down, and beat both fists as hard as he could on the ground. His matted hair bounced ridiculously, and dried clumps of dirt flew in all directions. And only then did Redrick look up at the ball. Carefully, with caution, with a hidden fear that it would turn out wrong, that it would disappoint him, evoke doubts, throw him from the cloud that he had managed to scramble up and leave him to wallow in filth. It was not golden. It was more of a copper color, reddish and completely smooth, and it shone dully in the sun. It lay at the foot of the quarry's far wall, cozily ensconced amid the piles of accumulated rocks, and even from that distance he could see how heavy and massive it was, and how solidly it lay in its place. There was nothing disappointing or doubt-inspiring about it, but there was nothing to inspire hope either. For some reason, his first thought was that it was probably hollow, and that it should be hot to the touch from being in the sun. It obviously did not glow with its own light, and it obviously was incapable of floating up and dancing in the air the way so many of the tales had it. It lay where it had fallen. Maybe it had fallen out of some monstrously huge pocket, or it had gotten lost, rolled away during some game between some giants. It had not been carefully placed here. It had been left behind, littering up the zone like all the empties, bracelets, batteries, and other rubbish remaining after the visitation. But at the same time, there was something about it, and the longer Redrick looked at it, the clearer it became that it was pleasant to look at, that he wanted to go up to it, to touch it, pat it, and suddenly the thought came to him that it would be good, probably, to sit down next to it, or even better, to lean back against it, close his eyes, and think, reminisce, and maybe just dream, and drowse, and rest. Arthur jumped up, tore open all the zippers on his jacket, took it off, and threw it down smack at his feet, raising a cloud of white dust. He was shouting something, making faces and waving his arms, and then he put his hands behind his back and, dancing a jig, headed down the slope. He was not looking at Redrick anymore. He had forgotten Redrick. He had forgotten everything. He was going down to make his wishes come true. The little secret wishes of a blushing college student, of a boy who had never seen any money beyond his allowance, who had been beaten mercilessly if he had a whiff of alcohol on his breath when he came home, and who was being groomed to be a famous lawyer, and in the future a cabinet minister, and in the distant future, and as his greatest prospect, president. Redrick, squinting his swollen eyes against the blinding light, silently watched him go. He was cool and calm. He knew what was about to happen, and he knew that he would not watch, but it was still all right to watch. And he did, feeling nothing in particular, except that deep inside, a little worm started wriggling around and twisting its sharp head into his gut. And the boy kept walking down, dancing a jig, shuffling to his own beat, and the white dust rose from his heels, and he was shouting at the top of his lungs, clearly, joyously, festively, either a song or an incantation, and Redrick thought that this was the first time in the history of the quarry that a man went down there as though he were going to a party. And at first he did not listen to what his talking key was yelling, and then something clicked inside him, and he heard, "Happiness for everybody! Free! As much as you want! Everybody come here! There's enough for everybody! Nobody will leave unsatisfied! Free! Happiness! Free!" And then he was suddenly silent, as though a huge fist had punched him in the mouth, and Redrick saw the transparent emptiness that was lurking in the shadow of the excavator's bucket grab him, throw him up in the air, and slowly, slowly twist him, like a housewife wringing her wash. Redrick had time to see one of his dusty shoes fall off his jerking leg and fly high above the quarry. Then he turned away and sat down. There wasn't a single thought in his head, and he had somehow stopped sensing himself. Silence hung heavy in the air, particularly behind him, there on the road. Then he remembered the flask without particular joy, but just as a medicine that it was time to take. He unscrewed the cap and drank with tiny, stingy sips, and for the first time in his life he wished that instead of liquor the flask contained cold water. Time passed, and more or less coherent thoughts came to him. Well, that's it, he thought unwillingly. The road is open. He could go down right now, but it was better, of course, to wait a while. The meat grinders can be tricky. Anyways, he had some thinking to do. An unaccustomed exercise, thinking, that was the trouble. What was thinking, anyway? Thinking meant finding a loophole, pulling a bluff, pulling the wool over someone's eyes. But all that was out of place here. All right. Monkey, his father. Make them pay for that. Steal the bastards' souls, let the sons of bitches eat what I've been eating. No, that's not it, Red. I mean, that is it, but what does it mean? What do I need? That's cursing, not thinking. A terrible presentiment chilled him, and quickly skipping over the many arguments that were still ahead of him, he told himself angrily, "This is how it is, Red. You won't leave here until you figure it out. You'll drop dead here, next to the ball, burn to death, and rot, but you won't leave. God, where are the words? Where are my thoughts? He slapped his head. I've never had a thought in my entire life. Wait. Kirill used to say something like that. Kirill. He feverishly dug through his memories, and words floated to the surface, familiar ones and unfamiliar, but it was all wrong, because Kirill had not left words behind. He had left pictures, vague and very kind, but thoroughly improbable. Meanness and treachery. They'd let me down in this, too. They left me speechless, the bastards. A bum. I was always a bum, and now I'm an old bum. It's not right, do you hear me? In the future, for once and for all, this should be outlawed. Man is born in order to think. There he is, old Kirill at last. Only I don't believe it. I didn't believe it before, and I don't believe it now. And I don't know what man is born for. I was born, so here I am. People eat whatever they can. Let all of us be healthy, and let all of them drop dead. Who is us and who are they? I don't understand a thing. If I'm happy, Burbridge isn't. If Burbridge is happy, Four Eyes isn't. If Throaty is happy, no one else is. And if things are bad for Throaty, he's the only one fool enough to think he'll manage somehow. God, it's just one long brawl. I fight all my life with Captain Quarterblad, and he fights all his life with Throaty, and all he wants from me is that I give up stalking. But how can I give up stalking when I have a family to feed? Get a job? I don't want to work for you. Your work makes me puke. Do you understand? This is the way I figure it. If a man works with you, he's always working for one of you. He's a slave and nothing else. And I always wanted to be myself on my own so that I could spit at you all, at your boredom and despair. He finished the dregs of the brandy and threw the empty flask to the ground with all his might. The flask bounced, flashing in the sun, and rolled away. He forgot about it immediately. He sat there, covering his eyes with his hands, and he was trying, not to understand, not to think, but merely to see something of how things should be. But all he saw were the faces, and more faces, and greenbacks, bottles, bundles of rags that were once people, and columns of figures. He knew that it all had to be destroyed, and he wanted to destroy it. But he guessed that if it all disappeared, there would be nothing left but the flat, bare earth. His frustration and despair made him want to lean back against the ball. He got up, automatically brushed off his pants, and started down into the quarry. The sun was broiling hot. Red spots floated before his eyes. The air was quivering on the floor of the quarry, and in the shimmer it seemed that the ball was dancing in place like a buoy on the waves. He went past the bucket, superstitiously picking up his feet higher and making sure to not step on the splotches. And then, sinking into the rubble, he dragged himself across the quarry to the dancing, winking ball. He was covered with sweat and panting from the heat, and at the same time a chill was running through him. He was shuddering as if he had a bad hangover, and the sweet chalk dust gritted between his teeth. He had stopped trying to think. He just repeated his litany over and over. I'm an animal. You see that. I don't have the words. They didn't teach me the words. I don't know how to think. The bastards didn't let me learn how to think. But if you really are all-powerful, all-knowing, then you figure it out. Look into my heart. I know that everything you need is in there. It has to be. I never sold my soul to anyone. It's mine. It's human. You take from me what it is I want. It just can't be that I would want something bad. Damn it all. I can't think of anything. Except those words of his. Happiness. For everybody. Free. And no one will go away unsatisfied.